Welcome to another episode of the Giants Huddle podcast. My name is John Schmeelk. It's all brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. This is also going to appear on our draft season podcast because, well, it's about scouting. And who better to talk about it than one of the guys that's teaching the next generation of scouts? He's Dan Hatman. It's the second time he's joined us on our program. He's a director of scouting development at the Scouting Academy. Dan, John Schmeelk here in East Rutherford, New Jersey, getting ready for the start of training camp. This will be airing the second week of training camp as the college football season is starting and NFL teams are evaluating the people in camp. I figured this is the best time to kind of do a scouting 101 type episode. And who better to talk about it than you? How are you, man? It's good to see your your face and hear your voice.
I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me. This is a great time of year. Always good to have football back and to see guys hit the field and let the process begin all over again.
Absolutely. So let's kind of set the base here, Dan. And we have about 40 minutes here to kind of talk about scouting. Talk about the Scouting Academy, what you do, what your background is, so people understand where you're coming from with all this.
So the Giants were my first NFL club. I started as a student at University of Albany. We did training camp and was able to work my student assistant time there into an opportunity with the Giants and kind of launched it from there. I worked for the Giants and one of the Jets and the Eagles. I worked for two different college programs in that time as a coach. And all of it kind of led me to this understanding there's a chicken and egg problem in football, right? Teams wanted people that knew what to do, but the only place to learn what to do is with a team. And that doesn't really fit the needs of folks that are aspiring to it. It doesn't fit the team's needs because they need a robust candidate base as well. So we plugged in 9 years ago to try to address that, to take the fundamentals of the evaluation process and bring that to the public, let them kind of self-select if they're interested, let them level up, and then bring those folks back to the teams and say, hey, here's some excellent folks for you guys to consider. It all kind of stemmed off the idea that regardless of which team I had worked for, and I mentioned the three on the NFL side, they all had a different type of receiver that they were looking for. But at the receiver position, we were all tasked with studying how they got off the line of scrimmage, right? How they run around, how they catch the ball. So there are fundamentals that go underneath the position that regardless of what style, right, what end product of receiver you like, we can still look at those bones, those structures, those traits along the way and get an understanding of the position. And so that's what we try to bring to folks and help them level up that way.
Yeah, I think that's great. So let's start with this part first, and then we're going to kind of jump position by position here for what you look at and how you do the process. We talk about grading players. I think people think of how you grade on a test, right? So based on the number of questions you get right, you add up and you get a higher grade and you get a higher grade. So the best you do, you get a better grade. And while the basic concept, better player, better grade, does apply here, that's not generally how grading systems work in the NFL, where kind of depending on the numerical system, and all teams do it a little bit differently, one grade will mean future Pro Bowler. One will mean maybe future backup. So can you just explain to me what these grades mean and how, as a scout, you put them together when you're filing your reports?
Sure. So there's a few structures of grading scales that exist in the NFL, and there's derivations of that, again, based on the decision maker. But a lot of it stems from a framework that came from Gil Brandt and the Cowboys system, or came from Bucko Kilroy, what happened in New England, and kind of that flowed through the Giants and got built up in a lot of ways there. And so the Giant structure, and that stems into Blesto's system, and I can talk a bit about that, or what Dallas and what ended up kind of taking over in NFS, or National Football Scouting. And it's come a long way, but it's kind of come back down to two main systems today, which is kind of off the Ron Wolf tree or off the Belichick tree. A lot of folks either fit one camp or the other. And one's based more on a kind of final value of a player. And the New England system is based more on the role. What are they going to do? And then let the market kind of dictate the value from there. But in both systems, a scout's can be tasked with some written description of what does this guy mean to our roster, right? What are things that we can expect him to do? Should we expect him to be on an immediate starter? Do we expect him to be on and develop into that? Do we expect him to be on our roster in a specific role? Is he part of a rotation? Is this a backup that brings quality depth? Is this a veteran? Is this an ascending player, a declining player? So we end up taking a large amount of information and trying to distill it back down into one of those profiles. And then that ultimately determines a grade, a value based on whatever system that team subscribes to.
All right. So just to kind of nail in on that, my understanding by what you just described, some teams will grade guys, all right, first round pick, late first round, early second round. And that's kind of how they do it, right? And that'll be consistent year to year. Then the other side, and I imagine this is probably the side that Joe Shane comes from, right? Because he was from the Parcells in Miami, and that comes from the Belichick, and that's from that side of the family. You're going to give a guy a numerical grade, and that's going to be, all right, well, we think he's going to be a future, let's say future average starter in the league, right? But then depending on the draft year, one year that might be the 25th best player in the draft. The next year that might be the 46th best player in the draft, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that first camp, I mean, even when you put a round on it, it's still going to have a description.
Of course.
This is a guy I think is going to be an immediate impact starter, that kind of stuff. The more, again, to use the language, New England style system, because there's so many disciples of that who've gone off and are running programs around the league. A lot of that's just based on, this is going to be our third corner, who's also going to be on coverage on kickoff or what have you. And it's very now focused in like, who are they better than now? Who are they worse than now? Like literally, where do they slot into our existing roster? And then we can talk a little bit about the future, but not a ton. Whereas the other side, it's going to have more the 2 to 3 year run of, if they get coached and if we hit upside, what may they be? So I think it kind of splits in a little more of now versus later in the thought process.
It's funny. You actually took my follow-up right out of my mouth here. So my question was going to be asked then, are there different levels within the tiers and the grades, right? Where you're like, well, this guy maybe only started playing football as a junior in high school, right? So we think he has more room to grow, maybe better athletic testing, so more upside, while maybe someone else, he's been playing the position his whole life, he doesn't test very well, so he might be a finished product. How does that get baked into when you're putting together that evaluation number, or is that just more in the description when you read it?
That's going to get baked in through the whole process. Ultimately, your organization has to set out some understanding of where we think we are. Are we going to be a utilization program? Are we going to be a development program? And that can vary by position, right? I remember talking to a team a couple of years ago, and their receiver coach was very much an X's and O's. He could install the system. He could bring the players to the understanding of where they needed to be at a certain time and how the plays were going to get called. But that guy was an offensive line coach by trade. He was in that role because he was a very trusted advisor in the game planning process to the head coach, right? Kind of his right hand in those situations. But again, not going to teach the player necessarily how to do it that well, just what to do, right? And that same team, their offensive line coach had come out of the college system. He'd been there for 15 years, developing lumps of clay, so to speak, right? And so he had a long history of taking traits and turning it into a player, teaching them how to do it, not just what to do. So when we talk about utilization versus development, that's really what it comes down to. Are you going to teach them what to do or how to do it? And obviously, if a coach can do both, that's great. But a lot of the timing and what we need back from the player is more immediate now. We don't have these 2 to 3 year runways in a lot of cases. What are we getting out of the first 9 months of the guy? 18's kind of, by 18 months, we're almost always talking about, well, do we like him or not? Right? This could be coaches, GMs, players, whatever. 18 months in, we've pretty much moved on from development into what are we getting from them. So the timelines have condensed in a large way.
So you're looking at 2 seasons, right? You're going to have a pretty good feel for this player after 2 seasons, barring, of course, there's no injuries or anything like that.
I mean, I wouldn't say you have a good feel, but I think the importance of being able to answer what do we think we're getting comes out at that point. For some players, you mentioned the idea of a guy that's had a lot of time at a position or a lot of time playing the game versus a guy that hasn't. I remember hearing this in the process a couple of years ago when it was the Justin Fields, Trey Lance year, right? In a conversation that came up that I was a part of was Justin Fields had been part of all the Elite 11 camps, right? And all the different training programs. And he'd been at Ohio State, and he'd been at Georgia, he'd been at every developmental thing. And then you got a guy, Trey Lance, who's taught to throw to the fullback in the flat because North Dakota State wants to run the ball. And he missed the COVID year, only had the one game, all this other stuff that went into it. And so the conversation was, if both guys are producing in a similar way right now, right? It's the old 2 guys run to first base, they get there at the same time. One has bad technique, one has great technique. Which one do you want? Right. It was, well, I want the guy with bad technique because if I coach him up, he's going to beat the other guy. And so this person was articulating, like, I would rather have Trey Lance because he hasn't been developed the same way. So if they're presenting similarly now, I want the guy that I think has higher upside than the other guy. Obviously we'll see if that bears out this season, but that becomes part of the thought process. It's not just where are they at, but a lot of times how they've been brought to that point so that you can try to predict what that future may be.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Sam Darnold year too, right? A guy, he was a linebacker in high school, if I remember correctly, right? And he was a guy.
Yeah, hadn't played quarterback much.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same type of deal. All right, so let's jump to quarterback here, and then we can always jump back to some general things as we go along. As the quarterback has changed here, Dan, how you have taught scouting the position change? And I'll throw a couple things at you. You can take it whatever direction you want. More importance of the athleticism, right? We saw where Daniel Jones last year, like running was such a huge part of his success. Throw in the fact that NFL offenses now look a little bit more like college offenses, depending on what offenses you're talking about. So how has that changed, and what to you now are the most important traits that you're looking for out of that quarterback spot? Some things that you can contextualize in numbers and maybe some things that you can't.
So I'd start by saying that we still look at the same things we used to look at, right? It wasn't that we were ignoring if a quarterback could move. The priority of how much they could move has really shifted. I get this question a lot on running backs in the passing game, right? How you would change running backs in the modern. We always looked if they could run around to catch the ball, just like we've always looked if a quarterback could extend plays. But what we need from that has changed. And then you mentioned how the systems are run in college, how the systems are run in the NFL. I think some of the floor of processing has come down as teams have worked to take some of that ownership on them as coaches to make some of those things more simple so then the quarterback can go execute, at least in those first couple of years. It may not be the entire tenure of that player's career, but in those first couple transition years, coaching, taking more ownership of the decision-making process. So I think some of the floor of that has come down, while the floor of what you need in terms of extending plays in or out of the pocket has come up. Coach Steve Fairchild said it this way. I think it's a pretty quality way to sum it all up. Quarterback play is going to break down into kind of three buckets, all equal. About a third of the plays stay on structure, right? What was called and designed ends up happening. Protection holds, receivers run, you get to do your job. About a third of the plays, right? The defense is going to do something that's going to take you off schedule, but you can still remain on structure. One guy penetrates, I got to make a little bit of move in the pocket, right? One of my receivers sees a difference in the coverage, he's got to adjust a route. And so we've got to move it a little bit, but we can still stay on the same script. We just got to change the timeline of it. And then about a third of the plays, the play doesn't work. Like something completely broke down, our guy, their guy, something. And now we've got to, move things on the fly. And so you'd like a quarterback who has a way of solving problems in all three of those buckets. It's really hard to have an entire third of the game where you're going, I don't think this guy can do that. And so what they have to do can vary. There's different ways guys can solve problems, but they have to have a solution. Like if you were going to be a statue quarterback, right, you better be really good at anticipation, right? Subtle movements in the pocket. We always talk about Brady, right? It was the subtle movements in the pocket.
Yeah, Joe Burrow's the same way, right? Yeah.
What's that?
Joe Burrow's the same way. He's not super athletic, but he moves in the pocket tremendously.
Does a great job about finding space in the pocket to keep the play on script versus watching a Patrick Mahomes who might completely depart the pocket to find a new patch of grass to then set up and make the play work. They both solve the problems, right? Burrow, Mahomes doing great jobs, but they solve it different ways. So I think what becomes challenging for us evaluators is to not get beholden to one way to solve a problem. And to be able to look at a player and say, what do they do to solve the problem? Do they have any way of solving it? And then does that give us a value?
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New you moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
The one thing, Dan, to me, that's most important for evaluating a quarterback, and I think as someone that did not grow up in coaching or playing and also doesn't, know what offense the college is running, maybe it's hard to do. And that's how well does the quarterback see things, and how much does the game slow down for them when they're evaluating what they're seeing, right? Kelvin Gilbride's always said this to me that, the quarterback can be super accurate, he can have the best arm, but if he can't see what the defense is doing, slow the game down and throw it to the right guy, none of the other stuff really matters. That's really important. So as a scout, and you don't know what the design of the college offense is necessarily when I'm watching the tape, how would you suggest to someone like me who is more of a layman trying to do this, figuring out how well the quarterback sees the field, anticipation, and slows the game down, which I think something you have to do well going from college to the pros if you want to succeed?
I think one of the challenges we all face, and whether you're just entering it, whether you've been in it for a long time, coaches are spending all of their time in this cat and mouse chess game with each other, right? Consistently evolving and spending, we always talk about coaches' hours in the office, right? We know they're spending a lot of hours. They're spending all of those hours on that process. They are moving, they are shifting, they are adapting, they are not a static thing. The evaluation community does not spend all of our time studying coaching. We are not developing, we are not chasing that. So we spend a portion, right? We should all be spending some portion of our time trying to understand scheme, but we're not going to spend all of our time doing it. So we will never have the understanding that they have from that standpoint, right? And so that becomes a challenge in the evaluation process. Is whatever the offenses are doing now, they're not going to do that in 2 years, right? They're going to have to continue to move and adapt. So whatever we come to understand about what this coach is doing this year, go look at their playbook in 2 years. They'll have some similarities, but they won't be a static thing. They'll move, they'll shift. So on an individual play, I would agree, we're never going to know what exactly they were taught that particular game, right? We can see the same 3-man passing concept, and this week we're going to read it a little differently than we read it last week, right? Same 3 guys, same 3 routes, and last week we read the inside route, then the outside route, then we came down to the flat. This week we're going to read the flat to the inside to the outside. Like, it's all with triangle based in a lot of those things. But which one in which order is a variant? So what you have to do is you have to trend it over time, right? We're not watching one play. We're not watching one game. We're watching a series of games. Quarterbacks usually 7, 9 plus exposure over multiple seasons. And you have to see over that time, does this player, again, put the ball into good positions or do they not, right? And so it's that larger exposure to them that's going to walk us to that answer rather than the individual play.
And, here's a good follow-up there, but this is something I struggle with. I have limited time. I'm trying to watch, in a span of 4 months, a couple hundred college prospects. We don't have the ability, Dan, via PFF and other things to sort plays, right? You don't have to just watch games and wait for the receiver's 12 targets. You can just go watch all his targets, right? You can pick situations for quarterbacks. I want to see 3rd and 6 plus. Does it vary by position? Or does it make sense now to kind of sort plays to get the most out of your time? Do you still suggest watching full games for all the positions? How would you suggest using some of that new technology and the ability to sort plays and pick and choose what you watch when you're scouting these players?
Yeah, you mentioned, PFF and their relationship there with Catapult and Thunder, and there's a group called Telemetry as a product, and they have an excellent tool as well. The filtering, the efficiencies that we have now, like when I started with the Giants, it was beta tape.
Yeah.
Right. So it was us on a machine going reel to reel, making cut ups. If you didn't have the physical tape from the Dub Center, you weren't watching it. It was definitely a different ball game. I still recommend to folks to start with a couple of games. There's something about game flow, right? And watching the good and the bad back to back, watching series all the way through, especially at a position like quarterback, that becomes important. From that, we should be able to generate questions. Right. To me, good film study is the ability to generate interesting questions, because the film can't answer everything. Right. If I look and I can see the quarterback did not make a good decision, right, that's just a result. I don't know the process that led into that. All that should lead me to is, well, what process led into that? Why did they make that bad decision? Right. I want to continue to ask questions of whatever that result is, which is usually going to lead me to the player or their coaches or what have you. So you're going to watch those couple games. You should be generating those questions, and then you bring that to the filtering tool and bring it down. So if I'm like, hey, I really like what he does between the 20s, kind of long yardage when he's got all the options available to him, but when it's 3rd and 9 and everybody in the planet knows what he's going to do, it doesn't work that well. At least it didn't look like that way in that first couple of games. Now I can go take a season or 2 worth of 3rd and 7 plus, right, and look at all of it. Instead of seeing 14 plays, now I might have 60. And as I increase that sample size, I can get more conviction on where I fall on how he does in that individual area.
The John Soto Podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Giants. From game day to every day, Citizens is made ready for Giants fans with insights, guidance, and solutions. Learn more at citizensbank.com. Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to go about it, because you're right. And especially for positions like cornerback and safety, you can watch 120 plays in 2 games and get like 6 plays where the guy's doing something. So there are some positions that are more frustrating to watch than others. But I guess you're right. Just watching the game flow, because, score and time affects how a guy might play too, right? And then you then kind of narrow in on what you think your strengths and weaknesses, and you try to increase that sample size based on flow, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much of that that can be done. The DB one you brought up is so fascinating because, again, the point of attack, right, when they actually interact with a ball carrier or a ball in the air or what have you, can be so limited. We've been able to filter that for a number of years now. But part of that position, right, is to take away those options, right? They could do a really good job by not being at the point of attack. If I did a job and keep them from wanting to put the ball there, my production numbers may not be great. So
deep safeties, especially, right? Because if you're there deep, they're just not going to throw it at you.
Exactly. So one of the things you end up doing in these new filtering tools is taking it to particular formations or things that can be challenging. Like now I can go look at all the times that they were the deep safety over the top of a 3-by-1 formation. Right. And I want to see how they deal with 3 different options and how they sort that out and how they relate to that. Those filtering mechanisms are great for that. And I can get into those different, I want to see them against 12 personnel. I want to see them against 11 personnel. And I can break all that down way faster.
Absolutely, 100%. All right, let's jump to a few more positions here, Dan. Running back. I feel like running back is so much instinctual. The testing matters, and I think testing does, indicate, if you look at just the numbers, guys that run under a certain amount of a much higher rate of success. But how about the instinctual stuff? Feel, finding the hole, patience to the hole. I imagine that's just something you have to watch and you just kind of have to get a feeling about, right? Is there really a good way to, even with all the new, player speed stuff and analytics, is there a way to really put some of that on paper, or is that just a feel thing watching the guy?
I haven't seen anything yet from kind of the next gen stat or any of the modeling stuff that gets into how a runner deals with certain situations. Like we've done it on a play call, right? We can do modeling based on inside zone or perceived outside zone, and they take and you build a definition in the computer about, hey, this is what outside zone should look like, and if the linemen do this to a certain percentage, then we're going to call it outside zone. But even if you take all the plays that are outside zone, what actually happens? Like how many times does your play side guard get the reach, or how many times was there penetration that you had to deal with, or what have you? All of that changes a great deal, and so I don't think we've quite gotten there yet. There's a lot of smart minds working on it. We'll see how that continues to develop. But ultimately, you brought up a great point. Running back, like the athletic floor, right? We reach that pretty quickly. We eliminate those who don't have that very, very quickly in the process. And so the guys that reach an NFL level are all going to be very high-end athletes, right? We're going to, again, already eliminate those that can't. The difference between those that then stick and produce and then those that don't is, again, the mental part. I think at a lot of positions, quarterback, we just talked about, running back now, again, the athletic ability sets the floor. It's the mental that sets the ceiling. And that's really where a player can take off and take it to a whole new level. So our ability to figure out what a running back is seeing, how they're making reads, and how they're stacking that information. You brought up pace and tempo. Do you know when to stay with your block, when to come off your block? Do you know how your linemen want to do certain things? Do you know how to manipulate a linebacker to create an opening? Like, I might want to take the linebacker and bring them over to the play side, make them commit to that because I know I'm going to cut back. I have an understanding, and there's then a balance between what did you learn in the classroom, right? And what did you learn in your film study? And what did you practice? And then what are your eyes taking in on the field? And so, to me, the term instincts is really about anticipation, right? Can you anticipate something happening before just being able to read and react to it? And that stacks a lot of different things. Like there are more opportunities at running back than other positions to be kind of a schoolyard instinctual player, but there's still a lot of reads and processing that go into it. Like we did a little video breakdown on our social channels the other day on Saquon and showing different reads that he made on a run. Like the athletic part stood out. I mean, that wasn't hard, but a couple things that he did in terms of reading where his blocker's hat were at, reading backside flow, knowing how to come off of that. And it really makes a big difference in how a running back performs overall.
I think, Dan, wide receiver is a position we have been able to put a lot of numbers on, all right? Especially with the zebra testing, you can test change of direction in real time, straight ahead speed in real time. What are some of the most important things that you've really zeroed in on? As I think, quite frankly, wide receiver scouting has become a lot better and a lot more precise and a lot more accurate as you've gotten some more of this data on their spots. What are some of the most important things to you when you're taking a look at those guys and you're trying to parse them?
Again, I think we do a good job in eliminating those that don't have certain ingredients, right? Certain parts to their game. I think what becomes hard is, does the player know how to string those together in a certain way to generate a result, right? There's going to be players that have a height or a speed, or they have a change of direction part. But that in and of itself, by comparison to their peer, the NFL defensive back, probably isn't going to do the job all by itself, right? There's not going to be a ton of guys that are just going to purely out athlete an NFL defensive back, right? So you're going to have to stack a mental component and a technical component and a physical component. And when do you do that? And how do you do that? Being able to use the stem, to use tempo or head fakes or angles or get into blind spots, then when to apply technique, what techniques. And again, I go back to the idea of letting the player be a problem solver, right? Let the player show you how they get that done, because I came up in an era with like the Anquan Boldens and the Calvin Johnsons. Well, those guys solve problems in a completely different way, but they both did a great job, produced a ton of yards, a ton of points, what have you. I came into the Giants and we had Plaxico Burress and we had Mario Manningham. They're guys that produced, but they didn't produce the same way or for the same reasons. You have to let the player show you that they have a way of getting that done, but it's more than just having a raw set of ingredients. It's about how do they put those together in a meaningful way.
I thought Jamar Chase was an interesting example of this, right? Because you watch Jamar Chase, the production was obviously off the charts, but it's not like he was gaining 6 yards of separation on guys. He would, like, his body control, which is something that I think is very difficult to quantify, is something where, and Randy Moss was the same way, where they're running full speed and they're running fast, but they can change direction and adjust their body as though they're only going at half speed. When other guys, if they're running full speed and they try to turn to locate the ball, they're going to trip. They're going to lose, their miles per hour are going to drop. But those guys just managed to keep running the same speed, and it's smooth. And again, I think those are things you just have to watch, right? Because you can't really put numbers on those.
Not yet. Again, the things I wondered if we could ever put numbers on 10 years ago versus what we're doing today. We'll continue to see how that progresses. But I think that's going to be a really hard one to differentiate, because seeing if the XY coordinates, right, what's being mapped in the computer, are remaining at the same speed. The computer can't tell where the shoulders were or what have you. I know we have it in both pads. Like, technically there's some orientation, but I don't think that how accurate that is gives us that kind of detail yet. I know I'm talking to some people about that, like, the offensive and defensive linemen, we're not at a good enough place in terms of shoulder turn to necessarily get there. We'll see if the technology can get better. So yeah, right now you're going to have to watch that play out, right? You're going to have to watch that person contort their body while at full speed. Almost every NFL receiver can change directions at a low speed, right? When they have not gotten all the way there. And that ends up tripping us up a lot of times when people come into the evaluation space. We will see a receiver change directions and then say, well, see, they can change directions. Well, they all can when they're not at their max speed. Otherwise, we wouldn't leave them at the receiver position. There's a survivor bias to it. But it's when we get past that and say, okay, now when you have gotten to almost or fully to your max speed, can you still do all of these different movement patterns? And that's a huge differentiator in that population.
And we are seeing that now with some of the change in direction metrics, whether or not guys do maintain their speed on their routes in the change in direction, and some of that with the zebra technology and stuff, they are able to quantify at least some of that. And that, to me, with wide receiver, Dan, very quickly before we jump to a different spot, changing direction at top speed, and that's really the name of the game, right? If you can do that, that's going to create separation. And in the modern NFL, that's really the most important thing, right? We could talk about, and we'll get to size in a second. You could talk about size and stuff, but separation is what these teams are pretty much looking for, right?
It has. Again, when I came in, it was size. Big people beat up little people. But now I think we're understanding that if you are of a smaller frame, but you have these other tools, you can create dynamic plays, and not just necessarily based on size. I think part of it, receiver, depends on what's the style of the route break. Right. So if we're going to take a crosser, a post, a go, what have you, you can run that at your full speed. Right. I might be changing it at a 45-degree angle on a slant or a post, what have you. But fundamentally, I could carry my entire speed through that. If I take an in or an out cut, a 90-degree turn, but a speed cut, I do it soft and round. Again, I can take that at basically my full speed. If I'm going to take that 90 as a sharp turn, a complete right angle, if I'm going to do 135 degrees back on a curl or a hitch or what have you, those are different biomechanical systems, because the deceleration needed to stop, then change directions and reaccelerate. I can have a guy that's a full speed guy. We see tons of 6'3" plus guys with 4.3 speed that run. They accelerate, they run, it's all there. but it's in the deceleration. It's the ability to sink and do all that stuff better than the defensive back, where it gets hard. There's a diminishing return on height from that standpoint, right? Long legs, just the physics alone is going to usually slow down that player.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Is there a weight threshold for wide receivers anymore, or are we almost at the point where it doesn't matter anymore?
In terms of the low end?
Yeah, in terms of the low end, yeah.
Yeah, there still is. I mean, I think once you start getting under, 185 pounds, a lot of questions are going to come up. I think there's a ratio between height and weight that has to be factored in. Like if he's 5'9" versus 6'2". I always use the example of Robbie Anderson and DK Metcalf have similar bone structures in terms of height and wingspan and things of that nature, but clearly the build is drastically different. So we got to pay attention a little bit in those areas. I think there's still a low end. I think it's come down, another 10, 15 pounds from where it used to be. But yeah, I think we still care a little bit.
Yeah, Devontae Smith and Jordan Addison. We'll see if they can try to switch that a little bit, and even a corner, right? We looked at Emmanuel Forbes last year, who's like who was $165, I think, is 166. I remember, I think it was his weight coming out of college, and that's a guy that has to tackle every down. It just seems like the perimeter players are shrinking a little bit, Dan, right?
That very much so. Again, as we search for speed, right? Size doesn't always equal speed. Mass doesn't always equal speed. So smaller guys can usually hit those things a little better. And then again, I think you have to remain open to an outlier. I think it's hard to completely close off a certain weight and say, okay, if they're under 185, I am not even going to look at them. Like I've heard stories of head coaches and GMs in draft meetings, and a scout says, hey, I know we're looking for guys over 6 foot, but man, I've got this 5'10" and a half, and I like all these other things about him. And they're like, nope, I don't want, he's under 6 foot. I'm not even considering that player. And then I understand that you don't want to build a team of exceptions, right? We've heard that line. That's a
Parcells line right there.
Parcells line, but we have to be, I think, open to the exception. If you have a guy in a Forbes frame, right, and that profile, again, do they put together all the things needed to do that job? And if so, then I think they should remain in consideration.
Giant fans love a winner. It's why they love Citizens, named the 2022 best bank in the U.S. by The Banker as the official bank of the Giants and sponsor of the Huddle. Citizens is made ready for fans of Big Blue. Learn more at citizensbank.com. All right, Dan, offensive lineman. What are the most important traits now? Is length becoming less important for tackles, do you think? Is it more athleticism? How much does testing, do you think, really matter for offensive linemen? Is it all about technique? Is it fit with blocking scheme with the new team and the college? Like, there's so many things here. So what are the most important things you're looking for when you're trying to find the right offensive lineman for the right team?
They need everything. Offensive line, I think, is a true generalist position. Right, you can't have a role player. You don't have a guy that's a specialist in any one particular. I mean, what would you take as a complete deficiency from a guy at that position? Right, you wouldn't take a dumb guy, right? You wouldn't take someone that lacks technique. You wouldn't take someone that lacks athletic ability or lacks physicality. They need to have a high threshold at every marker. Now, I'm not saying that a guy is going to be elite at every one of those, but I think you have to have a higher floor at every single area, and I think it's why teams will take shots on big athletic linemen, right? In the top 50, we see it year after year that don't pan out. You have to take the shot at them because otherwise you won't get them, right? Those guys don't exist in day 3. But we will see day 2 and 3 linemen outperform those guys over and over and over again because that day 2 lineman, that day 3 lineman has the high floor in all those areas, but none of them look like a rock star level, right? They're just good. They're stable at all of those different parts of it. And so they do the job more efficiently. They do all the jobs at a better level than someone who has, he has a ton of length or he has a ton of athletic ability, or again, he's really technical, but he's not that strong, right? Or he doesn't change directions, or he can't bend, or he's stiff, or you just have to have a lot of things to play offensive line. It's a very demanding position to know who you're going to block, where they're going to be pre and post snap, what that does in terms of changing. We thought we were going to do this particular set of run blocks based on this front, but then they changed the front post snap. So now I got to adjust. Now that I'm adjusting, I got to change my technique. I got to change the type of steps that I take and how I get there and where that places my hands. And well, I thought I was going to be the guy that takes off to the second level. Now I'm not. Now I'm staying on and taking over the first level. It just goes on and on in terms of that position. So I think the differentiators in terms of scheme come down to kind of mass and power, right? Your ability to get vertical displacement. Vertical displacement meaning I'm going to take the guy in front of me, I'm going to drive him up the field, right? As opposed to horizontal displacement, I'm going to get lateral, I'm going to get outside of him in a way that he can't do. Those are, I think, where the linemen differentiate themselves more often than not. And then on the pass pro side, it comes down to how long can I leave him alone? That's like the simplest way I can take pass protection is how long can I leave this guy alone? Do I have to be running play action and RPOs? Do I have to slide to him? Do I have to give him some help? Do I have to make sure that it's quick game or we don't have a guy? Or can I get towards a 3-second play? Can I leave him alone in certain situations against certain opponents and we can still have a play? And I think those are the areas where that particular community can separate itself.
All right, let's jump over to defense here. How have you adjusted to the positionless defense, Dan? There's really no more 4-3 and 3-4. You don't really have defensive and outside linebackers anymore in the 3-4. They're kind of just edge rushers. Nickels now are star players. Are they safeties? Are they corners? Are they blitzers? They do everything. How have you kind of adjusted to the idea of the positionless defender, which is something Wing Martindale here at the Giants certainly does adhere to?
I'm going to use what I used at offensive line, the generalists. Like, again, what would you take your defender stinking at? I don't want him playing coverage. He can't do man. He can't do zone. He can't defend inside runs. He can't defend outside runs. What am I going to accept that my guy can't do? And really, the places that we see that are going to be outside lane corner. We might see that a little bit with a certain type of edge rusher, maybe can't defend the run, or maybe a deep safety that's a ball hawk but can't defend the run. But there's not a ton on defense where you can put a guy in who's going to have a glaring deficiency. Like, again, my job in the NFL was always as a pro scout. We would advance the other opponent, right? We'd study them. And then we're going into rooms with offensive coaches and delivering, okay, here's what this particular defender can't do, particularly those slot corners, those linebackers, right? That second level, that intermediate area that's so juicy for offenses to attack. As soon as you walk in and be like, okay, well, this guy can't do this job. You'd lose them because in their minds, they're charting all the plays in their playbook that they know they can occupy and take advantage of that guy with. He can't cover these tight ends in these areas. He can only be in the hook curl. He can't defend the outside run. He can't get to the edge. He can't come down and take on a block. They're going to figure out ways to attack that. So defenders have to be a lot of things. And again, I think that's taken us out of a certain body type because it's hard to say, okay, well, I want a Mike Backer that's 6'3" and 240 and still does all those things.
Right.
I don't know where to find those guys. So we are, okay, well, if I want all those things, now I got to be open to 6 foot and 225 or 230. Right now, I got to be open to the fact that he may not be an elite man corner, but he's a capable man corner, but he does all these things in zone. He can blitz off the edge. We can tolerate that. You just have to know your pieces, your spacing on defense, and again, find those pieces. But defenders are generalists. They're no longer specialists.
All right, I got 2 more questions, Dan. I'm going to skip over the defensive line because I feel like big, strong, athletic. I mean, there are so many people that are alive that can do that and play edge rusher, get off, strength, length. We know about what you need there. 2 positions I want to touch on, though, that I think I want to get into a couple details. One, traditional off-ball 4-3 or inside linebacker, however you want to look at the position, right? I feel like so much of that position, I don't really care about testing, to be honest with you. In some ways, there are thresholds, obviously, but it's instincts. It's being able to anticipate. It's playing off blockers. It's things like that, again, we love using numbers and quantifying, but I don't think for those inside linebackers, you can quantify a lot of the things they have to do with because offensives are designed now, Dan, as you know, to put those linebackers in conflict, right? Whether it's the read option, RPOs, take your pick, they're designed to put those linebackers in conflict. So how do you find good linebackers when you take out the numbers? Because again, I'm just not sure you can quantify a lot of the stuff that's important that makes you good at that position.
Yeah, I think we're going to go to fit on this one. And while we don't necessarily have the classic 4-3-3-4, every defense still has spacing. They have a certain way that they're going to deploy the front more often than not, a base teaching model that they're going to go with. And off that base teaching model, we're going to have certain gaps covered or uncovered, and we're going to have certain bubbles in certain places, and we know we're going to either box or spill, and where our support's going to come from, and all those kind of structural things. And it's knowing what you're going to do. Like if we're going to be a team that's going to heavily take our edge players, and we're going to box, we're going to funnel everything to the linebackers, right? Well, then we need a sturdy linebacker who can come downhill and accept all that. That's going to be funneled to them. If we are going to be taking all the A and B gaps and we're going to close them with our defensive line, we're going to send everything out to the perimeter. Well, then I need rangy guys, right? Because nothing's going to come up in the A and B gaps. We've clogged that. We're going to send it to the perimeter. We're going to spill everything outside. I need guys that can go and flow and take care of that. Knowing what my defenders and coverage, the third level, the DBs can do, then modeling that down a level. So if I know I'm going to be very man-oriented, well, then now I can have man-oriented linebackers, right? And I got to do my matchups accordingly, versus if I'm going to be more zone predicated on things, I need guys that can pick up and pass off. And you might get the number one receiver coming across your face, and you got to carry him for a little while before passing it off and know how to deal with those things. So again, they're going to be generalists. They're going to have a lot of different abilities on the floor, but it's so much about fit. I think linebacker ends up being kind of the last piece. Like once you know what your front's going to be, once you know what your coverage is going to be, then you start sliding those guys in to fill whatever those gaps are.
All right, final question. And you segued it perfectly, because when you look at corners now, Dan, a lot of times in college, you're not going to see them do everything you need them to do in the NFL, right? So many teams play quarters, they play off, they're not pressing, they're not mirroring. Some teams are, like we saw that with Cincinnati when Sauce Gardner, we saw him do that stuff, but you don't see that with a lot of guys. So when you're drafting corners now, how much are you drafting for scheme fit? And how can you determine sometimes what a cornerback's going to be able to do, even if you haven't seen him necessarily do in college?
So I think a lot of this is where we get to draw from that organization we're taking them from, right? So when you send your scouts on the road and they're going to Cincinnati and they're going to talk to the coaches there, you gotta be respectful with how you frame the questions. But hey, coach, what were you asking them to do? Was this a situation where it was just you have that guy and everywhere he goes, you just have that guy? Or were you making him read through 3 or 4 options and they had to sort things out and then know who to pick up and pass off? Again, were you playing top down where you're just driving down on things underneath you, or are you going to play under and near? You can see some of that on film, but I think film's going to give you some good questions to go to that staff with and say, hey, I saw this player doing that. Hey, coach, correct me if I'm wrong. Was this what you wanted him to do? And I think if you're respectful in that, especially if you defer to, hey, coach, tell me if I'm wrong, or something language like that, they love telling you if you're wrong. They'll coach you up pretty quickly on how we're bringing that guy along, and that can fill in a ton of those gaps.
But you are kind of drafting, like if you're a heavy zone scheme in the pros or a heavy man scheme, you're probably going to try to find the guy that you've seen do that, right? So whether or not a cornerback's going to succeed isn't necessarily whether or not he's good. It's whether or not you're asking him to do something that he's capable of doing in a lot of ways, right?
I think part of that comes down to market and what's in that tier that year. So if I've got 3 guys in that tier going in, I think they're all consideration for, middle of round 2 or whatever the case may be, early to middle of round 2. And then I'm sitting there and all 3 are still on the table. I got to have that, usually I have it before the draft. But you have that conversation about how would I stack these 3? And you can use those kind of things to what I would say, break up the cluster. Or we're going to stack those 3 now according to that. This guy did it the most. This guy's the most developmental. This guy, again, he's the hardest hitter, whatever the case may be. And you got to decide where my program's at that year, what's in the market, and then use that information accordingly.
All right. If people want to find out about the Scouting Academy, take your classes, Dan. Tell them how to find all your stuff.
Well, you can find our website at scoutingacademy.com. You can reach me personally at director@scoutingacademy.com with any questions that you have. We're trying to do a lot more here this coming season on our socials, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, with just teaching concept. We're going to break down plays and show you different parts of the game.
Well, we can't wait to see it, Dan. This was awesome. Thanks so much for the time, for joining us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants.